Hi everyone, so welcome to our online lecture for the socialization chapter. I'm hoping everything goes well with this QuickTime screen capture and that this isn't too long so it won't take forever to upload. But I'll definitely be able to cover all of the content for this chapter, and especially for this week, make sure that you're taking advantage of all the benefits of the mission tasks in preparing for your quiz and in the additional resources. So you can use the flashcards, read the chapter summary, there's a practice quiz, a matching game. So if you're feeling like not having our in-person lecture might take away from your quiz results, definitely take advantage of the additional resources or just get in touch with me and we could always have a little powwow about all the content. So because this week is more theorist based than some of the other chapters, I've made a handout for you. It's in the chapter 4 mission tasks, although you don't have to do anything. It's just for your benefit. A little bit of a quick reference guide for the chapter 4 theorists. So as I'm going through lecture today and you're hearing about Cooley, Mead, Goffman, Erickson, Piaget, Kohlberg, and Gilligan, think of this handout. You can follow along or read it over again afterwards to sort of cement those concepts in your mind. Another thing I did want to touch on about the mission tasks this week is the article. So the Who Should Teach Our Teenagers About Drinking at University lenses article and quiz. I have to click on the bowling here in order to show you the article. So if I go back to my mission tasks, here's the article. It has appeared. And it says, remember to click the highlighted portions for each sociological perspectives and read the pop-up boxes carefully. So when it opens up, it will look like this. And as you can see, it is clicked on that conflict theory portion. What that means is that it's going to highlight the portions of the article that echo the conflict perspective. So what you want to do is actually click on the highlighting and a little pop-up box will come up and tell you a little bit more about that connection and what the conflict theory might say about such a point. So that's what conflict theory looks like. Obviously, feminist theory, click on each of the highlighting and they have a new pop-up box. So remember to read all of those before completing the article quiz. Okay. So we are going to get into our online lecture. So we're on chapter 4, socialization, the process of fitting into society. So we're going to talk about what is socialization, how do the 4 theoretical perspectives view socialization, and how does understanding society help us to improve our society. So socialization in a nutshell is kind of like what makes us who we are, and it has a little bit to do with the process of human development, not just physical, but also emotional, intellectual, cultural, all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of like the rules we follow, how we learn the things that we know, the language we speak, the values we have. We want to know where they came from and how they were given to us and how they're passed down through generation to generation. So we internalize these cultural practices that have been constructed by other people who've come before us through this process that we call socialization. So here's our definition of socialization. It's the lifelong process by which the norms, values, and other aspects of a culture are learned and internalized by group members and provide the individual with the skills necessary for participating in society. So it's a lifelong process. Yes, a lot of socialization goes on during childhood, and this is called primary socialization. So something like your family, and they teach you how to eat, how to go to the bathroom, how to have table manners, how to talk, and what you believe in. All of those basic things come to you during the process of primary socialization. So primary kind of means first, right? So it's that first phase of socialization in your life that's really giving you the foundations that you need to exist in society. Whereas secondary socialization occurs sort of throughout your life. So there are lots of different life phases, and with them come new learning experiences that ask you to learn new behaviors and internalize new values. So even something as simple as learning how to act and dress and present yourself at a new workplace is something that we would classify as secondary socialization that might occur later in life. So secondary obviously comes after primary and is ongoing throughout the life. So it's not just a simple process that comes at you from childhood, but it's something that exists subtly throughout our entire life course. So, as we're talking about socialization, one of the most sort of poignant theories on how we learn to become who we are and how the process of socialization affects us is what's called the nature versus nurture debate. So, I'm sure you've heard of this before in other contexts, but it's basically two sides of a coin that have different arguments about how we become who we are and how we develop our sense of self. So, while most social scientists acknowledge the significance of the interaction between heredity or our nature and environment or nurture, most sociologists tend to come down more strongly on the side of nurture, which makes sense considering we're interested in human interactions, communication, groups, and all that sort of stuff. So, this means that we internalize the culture that's been constructed by others who came before us through this process of socialization. Um, and from this little picture, you can kind of see it's just kind of a silly example the nature versus nurture debate at the Oscars. And they say, I'd like to thank the Academy. And on one hand, nature says, and my lovely genes that are responsible for my dashing profile, irresistible voice, and on screen charisma. Whereas the nature person, or what he would say if this was nature, and my parents for taking me to the cinema, as well as my drama teacher, Mr. Roscoe, at the Academy of Fine Arts. So, nature emphasizes genes, genetics, things that come from one's genetic makeup, whereas the nurture side of thing credits environmental influences or things from the outside of a person. So, nature is the belief that genes that we get from our parents are the primary causes of human behavior, whereas nurture is the belief that our environment is the primary influence on the way we on the way in which we think, feel, and behave. Not sure if that makes sense, but nature really says that who we are comes down to we were born that way, whereas nurture would argue that it's your environment that makes you who you are. So if we were in class right now, we'd do a think, pair, share, and I'd have you talk to a neighbor about how you think you became who you are. But just reflect on that for a minute. Were you born who you are, and that was that? It was unchanging, unchangeable? Or is who you are something that's come from your interactions, your experiences, your successes, your heartbreaks? So think about, which side you think your personality and your sense of self came from. We're going to talk just a little bit more about it, and then we'll see if your opinion has maybe changed. So there are, again, lots of arguments that back up each side of the nature versus nurture debate. Your book does talk about the rhesus monkey study, on page 70 in the Think Sociologically box. And that would be a study that has reinforced the nurture side of the argument. So, primate studies and the rhesus monkey studies were completed by Harry Harlow. And what happened here is he wanted to study for the effects of isolation and concluded that isolation had a damaging effect on baby monkeys that were separated from their mothers. So, by isolating these baby monkeys with two different fake mothers, a cloth mother and a wire mother with a bottle, he wanted to see which of the mother monkeys, the fake moms, that the baby monkeys gravitated towards. Did they gravitate towards the wire monkey that had food that they needed to survive? Or did they gravitate towards the cloth monkey who was soft and cuddly and could provide some comfort to the baby monkeys? And what he found was that they did gravitate towards the cloth monkey. So that doesn't necessarily directly translate into human behavior, but it was an argument for the nurture side of things, that we as people develop who we are through interaction and through nurture and comfort with people who are close to us. Other examples for the nurture side of the debate have been case studies where actual children have grown up in extreme isolation situations. So, with the removal of the nurture element, children who grow up without any interaction and are simply left to depend on their nature, we can see the true importance of nurture by how damaged they were through not having any nurture. So, the two examples of Isabel and Jeannie are really interesting. Your book does talk about Jeannie as well throughout this chapter. They're similar and they both provide good examples of how it can be difficult to recover from the loss of early childhood nurturing. So, Isabel actually, until the age of 6, lived in isolation with her mom, who was deaf. So, they had no social interaction, communication, or language whatsoever. They had a really bad fear of strangers, and Isabel had the educational development of an infant, even at the age of 6. Um, but she learned to speak in sentences in 2 months, and in 9 months she could read, and in 3 years she was attending school. So, because she was 6, she could recover, whereas Jeannie was isolated until she was 14 years old. So even after a year of therapy, she still only had the grammar of an 18-month-old, and she never achieved full language capacity or the ability to live on her own for the rest of her life. So that window closed for Jeannie, the window where she could accept comfort, nurturing, and all of the um, things that benefit our development that are given to us through nurturing, through caring, through interaction and communication. Um, and I also wanted to show you one other example that came up in the news recently about a Siberian hermit who had been cut off from the world after her life, all her life, and she was introduced back into the 21st century when she was airlifted to the hospital to save her from the cold. So she and her family had actually lived in the Siberian tundra from the 1930s onwards, and all her family's actually died, and she's the last sort of remaining person to live in this little cabin in the woods. Um, so think about how interesting that must have been for her to grow up and develop a sense of self and personality without having other people to learn things from, to interact with, to um, sort of perpetuate that cycle of socialization. Um, so that's another modern example that we could kind of think of as an argument for the nature versus nurture debate. On the nature side of things, some studies that have been done that reinforce nature have been twin studies. So, identical twins who have been raised apart. So, they do have that natural genetic bond, but have been raised in different nurture scenarios. So, by isolating their similarities, we can sort of credit that to nature rather than nurture. And one of the most interesting examples I've read is kind of a historical example of these two men named Oscar and Jack. Oscar was raised in the Czech Republic. He was Catholic and a member of Hitler's youth movement, whereas his brother Jack was raised in Trinidad, Jewish, and served in the Israeli army. So they're identical twins, but have been raised in different circumstances. Could not be more different, right? So it was discovered later in life that they were twins, and they wanted to find out the things that they had in common. So some of their similarities were that they both wore wire-rimmed glasses, they both had mustaches, liked spicy foods and sweet drinks. They were both absent-minded and both flushed the toilet before using it. They both put elastics on their wrists and dipped their toast in coffee, which is like really weird to have in common. So it raises the question of, you know, is nature as important as nurture in developing our personalities? So these are really the arguments that keep this nature versus nurture debate ongoing, and it probably will continue for a really long time. As sociologists, of course, we come down more strongly on the side of nurture, again, because we're interested in the environment and our social environment and all that stuff. So think about whether your opinion on nature versus nurture changed at all from now, or from the think, pair, share moment until now. So now we're going to jump into the theories of socialization. And like I said, we have a handout on all of these theories and theorists. And really what they're trying to get at is developing theories that can explain how we come to have a sense of self, which is a distinct identity that sets us apart from other people. So the self is really important in understanding that socialization is something that gives us our personality, it gives us uniqueness, and that socialization and the self is not a static phenomenon, but something that continues to develop and change throughout our lives. So we can look at both psychological and sociological approaches to the concept of the self because both disciplines have shared interest in this subject. And as you can probably deduce by now, these theories of socialization and this analysis of the self is something that's micro-sociological and fits within the symbolic interactionist perspective, because it is looking at individual circumstance, it's looking at interaction, identity. But it's different from psychology because psychologists would look more at the mind and its development, and we're really looking at theories that have to do with social interaction from a sociological perspective. So let's get into it. All right, so Cooley's the first person that we're going to talk about. And the main takeaway from Cooley is that he developed what's called the looking glass self. So looking glass is another word for mirror. So basically, the looking glass self theory says that, like a mirror, the self develops through a process of reflection, or we use other people as a mirror for understanding who we are. He said that our self is established through interactions with other people. So we come to develop our personality through social interaction and the feedback that we get from others. So he said that this process contains 3 steps. The first one is that we imagine how our behaviors will look to other people. So when you're in a scenario, you're sort of thinking about what other people are going to think of you when you do act. The second part of the theory is that we interpret other people's reactions to our behavior. So when we do act, we are looking for their reactions, their positive or negative sanctions to our behavior, whether they think we're good or bad, or we're this or we're that. And from that, the third stage is how we develop our self-concept. So some examples of this, one of them in the textbook is the one on the left, where obviously from the back we can see that it's an old guy, but he's looking in the mirror and he sees this young hot dude. So the looking glass tells him that, the feedback he gets from other people is reinforcing his sort of youthful identity or his cool guy side or whatever it might be. And on the right, we can see the looking glass self in sort of 4 different mirrors for different people in the stick man's life. So on the left, the stick man is seeing an angel figure for how his mom and dad see him. So from the feedback that he gets from his mom and dad, he has a self-concept of a good guy. In front of him on the left is how his girlfriend sees him, and as you can see, he has little muscles that are popping up on his little stick arms. So apparently he's been getting feedback from his girlfriend that he's a super hot stick man. On the middle right, how his older brother sees him, his little muscles are drooping. And on the right, how his ex-girlfriend sees him with little devil horns. So the looking glass self process is ongoing, and it happens during each and every one of our interactions. It's all about perception. So it's us using our ability to read other people that informs how we think about ourselves. So we use other people as a mirror in order to understand how our behaviors are coming off and in turn developing our own self-concept. The next theorist that we're going to look at is George Herbert Mead. So this sort of theory about the I and the me can be a little bit abstract, but don't overcomplicate it, and I'll walk you through it. So really, Mead believed that the self is the part of the personal identity that has both self-awareness and self-image. So the self consists of two parts, according to Mead, and these are called the I self and the me self. So like I said, like he couldn't have named these things more similarly to be more confusing, but we'll get through it. The I is the subjective part of ourself. So the I is our acting self that acts. It's the part of us that does behaviors. It's spontaneous. It's the part of us that walks, reads, sings, smiles, speaks, or performs any other action that we might undertake. The I is impulsive. The I is spontaneous. The I is innate. So you could say that our I self is who we are. Whereas on the other hand, you could say that the me is who we think we should be. So the me is the objective part of the self. It's socialized. It's the socialized self that plans actions and judges our performances. So instead of being spontaneous and acting like the I, the me is reflective. And the me has internalized society's norms and expectations and places limits on the impulsive I. So that means we have to learn the me. The me develops over time because the me has very specific social and cultural expectations that it keeps in mind. So like I said, in a way, the I is who we are and the me is who we think we should be. So the me would plan an action. For example, in a class discussion, I might ask all of you guys a question, and you might know the answer. So your me in your head is kind of like, well, I know the answer to this, but I might not put my hand up because I could be wrong and I could look stupid and I might embarrass myself. So the me is having all these sort of reflective thoughts. Then all of a sudden your I puts their hand up. I ask you to answer the question and you get it right. Then your me is going to jump back into your head and say, wow, you did a good job. Morgan thinks you're super smart because you got that question right. Good thing we put our hand up. So again, the me will plan the action, the I does the action, and then the me comes back and judges your performance based on social standards. So in addition to the I and the me, Mead is also interested in how we develop this sense of self, or we could say the me. Where does the me come from? So he said that the self develops in 3 stages. So we've got the first stage, the imitation stage, which occurs from birth to about age 2. Children copy the behaviors of others, so they're imitating. They begin to understand the use of symbols, so things like gestures, what objects are, and words that form the basis of human communication. They'll parrot what a sibling or parent is doing without knowing what it is at first. So, for example, a baby will clap because they've seen other people do it, not actually meaning to give a round of applause. Or they'll wave back at other people, not even really knowing that it means hi, just because everyone's always waving their hands at them. So they start to learn that words and these actions are symbols that mean other things that they can use to communicate. Then this develops over the course of that stage and leads into the play stage at about age 2 to 4. Children begin to play roles and begin to take on the characteristics of important people in their world. So they're playing the role of other people in the play stage. So they become aware of other people and other social relationships, and they're pretending to be other people sometimes, like an actor becoming an actor, or like an actor becoming a character. So, for example, a child might tie a blanket around his or her neck pretending to be a superhero. Or you might play house or doctor or whatever it might be. Although their role playing is still relatively one dimensional. Their characters, you could say, aren't really fully formed. It's still a form of imitation, but more advanced than the first stage. Finally, in the game stage, the final stage, this is, school age. So 5 and up, children begin to understand that others have expectations and demands placed on them. So they begin to consider several tasks in relationships simultaneously, and that others have demands and expectations placed on their behavior. So, for example, in the play stage, they might not really realize that their teacher has, a life, that their teacher is also might be mom or dad or brother or sister or volunteer. Whereas in the game stage, they can understand that different people aren't just one dimensional, but that they have other parts of their personality, other relationships, other demands and expectations. So that is how those 3 stages sort of develop, according to Mead. In a social sense, these all have to do with relationships and interacting with other people and the meanings and complexity that sort of evolves throughout those 3 stages. So Mead also said that throughout those stages, children are going to have what are called significant others. So these are just important people in their lives. So you could name these people like mom, dad, brother, sister, all those important people in their life that have an impact on their behavior, who they want to impress and who teach them how to behave properly. Mead also theorized the generalized others. So this is our sense of this is our sense of others in general. So the norms, beliefs, and expectations specific to our culture. So they are kind of like a standard to which we hold our behavior, some of the reasons why we learn certain behaviors like manners. Um, they will not act politely to please a particular parent. Rather, the child comes to understand that courtesy is a widespread social value that's endorsed by parents, teachers, and authority figures. Um, so, generalized others, again, is kind of like quote unquote they, um, and a general understanding of how we're expected to behave towards they, others, other people in our lives, other groups. So the next theorist that we've talked about throughout the term, and he's, an important symbolic interactionist, Irving Goffman. So dramaturgy, as you should know, is the um, theory that compares to um, acting or like a play and says that life is like acting, that we're performing in different situations all the time. He said that social actors enter every situation with 2 selves. So something like a front stage self, that's what everyone sees. That's the performance that you put on when you go in public or when you're interacting with someone who doesn't necessarily get to see who you truly are. That's reserved for backstage. So this incorporates our true selves, our feelings, our beliefs, and we reveal our backstage self to people who are close to us. During any interaction, really, we engage in what Goffman called impression management. So during impression management, a performer attempts to manage the impressions that we make on others. So it's kind of self-explanatory. Um, so this is something that we do in order to create a distinctive appearance or to satisfy a particular audience, depending on what situation you're in. We're going to talk about some examples in a second. And finally, he talked about face-saving work. So when you want to save face, you've been embarrassed and you're doing some sort of a corrective behavior in order to avoid embarrassment or sort of make up for it in a way. So we engage in face-saving work through things like humor, so laughing it off, through anger. So anger sometimes helps us regain our power, although it might not be the most healthy face-saving work. Or also retreat. So if something bad or embarrassing happens to us, we'll just like leave the scenario. So if we were going to practice impression management, just think about how you would act in order to satisfy a particular audience in any of these situations. Or you could also think about face work too. How would you correct an embarrassment in any of these situations? So when you go to a bar or a pub or a club, you're going to act different than you would on a job interview. You're going to manage the impression that you give off in each of these scenarios. When you go to visit your grandparents, when you're in school, church, on a date, when you're at a formal event, or when you're just hanging around with your best friend or your siblings. Um, Again, the behaviors that you're going to engage in and the impression that you give off to the people in those scenarios is going to be different. So it's almost like you're acting out different sides of your personality. It's not a manipulative or bad thing, it's simply how Goffman theorized that we navigate our social environment in a way that makes sense for what we're encountering at that time. All right, so the next person we're going to talk about is Erikson. So Erikson proposed that humans develop a personality in 8 psychosocial stages. So again, a little bit about psychology, a little bit about social interaction. And during each stage, we experience a particular crisis that either has to be resolved positively or negatively to move on to the next crisis. So the outcome of each will have an effect on our ability to deal with the next, since they sort of build off of each other. The crisis at each stage of development must be resolved before you can successfully master the subsequent stages. Hopefully that makes sense. So on page 73 of your textbook, you can see a more fully formed sort of infographic of what you're seeing on the slide right now. So I'm not going to read each of the descriptions of all 8 stages out loud to you, but they do sort of relate it to the life course, as you can probably imagine, and throw in some other examples in there, such as Jeannie. In the first few stages, Jeannie was isolated and wasn't able to move through the further stages because the infancy, toddlerhood, preschooler, those young stages that are super, super important, weren't resolved positively, and it caused her a great deal of consequence. So we've got infancy, trust versus mistrust, toddlerhood, autonomy versus shame and doubt. So whether the toddler will be able to develop self-sufficiency or independence, that's what autonomy means. Then the preschooler stage, are they going to take initiative or feel guilt? In elementary school, it's the industry or sort of hardworkingness versus the feeling of inferiority. Adolescence, identity versus role confusion. Young adulthood, intimacy versus isolation. Middle adulthood, generativity, which means sort of like keeping moving, versus stagnation. Or late adulthood, which is integrity versus despair. So in each of these life phases, Erikson said that one or the other must be chosen in order to move on to the next, and it's got to be positively resolved. So I think that's a really interesting, again, psychosocial approach to understanding not only primary socialization, during the early stages of one's life, but also secondary socialization that occurs throughout the entire life. So I'm sure some of you have heard of Piaget before because this is a really famous theory on childhood development, and I know it's taught in the Anthro-Psych-Soc high school course, and any other maybe ECE or other sort of child development courses. Piaget's theory of cognitive development explains how we develop an ability to think, to reason, and this sounds a little bit psychological, but since the way that we think helps shape our self-concept, cognition does play a really significant role in socialization. So our intellect, our mental capacity, that sort of thing. And like I mentioned, his theory has been an important basis in the educational field. So Piaget talked about 4 stages in our cognitive development. Again, our ability to think, to reason, to use logic. The first stage is sensory motor from birth to 2 years, where we learn to experience and think about the world through our senses and our motor skills. So sensory motor uses the senses. So they're using their senses to make discoveries. Also, through touching, they realize that their hands are a part of themselves, something as simple as that. It's that self awareness. Also, in this stage, babies develop what's called object permanence. So they come to realize that objects that are outside of themselves still exist. So, for example, peekaboo, when you cover your face and it surprises the baby that, your face is underneath your hands when you open them, they haven't developed object permanence yet. So they think that your face is actually gone when you cover it up, right? But over the course of this stage, peekaboo will become less fun because they'll start to develop object permanence and they will develop the knowledge that your face is still underneath your hands. The next phase is the pre-operational stage, from age 2 to 7, where the child begins to use a lot of different words and symbols, and the ability to speak and communicate grows really rapidly during this stage. So they generally identify objects by a single characteristic at the beginning of this stage. So, for example, they will see and spell CAT, but not yet realize that this word is actually cat. This develops over the course of this stage, and that CAT and cat actually mean the same thing. So linking those things together develops over the pre-operational stage, and that's what allows language to really develop so rapidly. In the concrete operational stage, from 7 to 12, children are able to think about objects in the world in more than one way and start to understand causal connections in their surroundings. So this is the start of more logical thinking. For example, the clay that's used to make the shape of a snake is still clay. A paper airplane is still the plain sheet of paper that they saw beforehand. So children at this stage can also imagine what other people might be thinking or feeling, and their relationship to the world is becoming more complex. In the fourth stage, the formal operational stage, this occurs at around the age of puberty, so 12 years old and above. People become more able to comprehend abstract thought. So this means that the adolescent will become more capable of sophisticated thought and can deal with ideas and values in a logical manner. Morals are also start to develop and become more complex in this stage. And through testing reason and the complexities, they're now realizing children at this stage are often argumentative with people in authority because they're starting to, grapple with the, moral complexities of life, really. So those are Piaget's 4 stages: sensory motor, the senses; pre-operational, lots of language development; concrete operational, something that is developing logic and understanding; and formal operational, more sophisticated thought, abstract thought, not necessarily things that they can see, feel, and touch, but really big understandings of the world. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about 2 theories that have to do with moral development. So Kohlberg said that he wanted to build upon Piaget and wanted to learn a little bit more about how we make decisions based on our morals, so things that are right and wrong. So the first stage was what he called the pre-conventional stage, and he said that we make moral judgments at this stage based on hedonism, which means seeking pleasure over pain. So pre-conventional is the first stage of moral development that lasts through elementary school years. And at this level, children make their moral judgments within the framework of hedonism. So they judge what's right and wrong based on what feels good to them. So this, a lot of the time, means avoiding punishment, right? In the second level, the conventional level, children will use the lens of norms and rules to determine what's right and wrong. So in the second stage, moral development arises through the use of being told what is right, and generally that's obedience to a particular rule rather than questioning the logic behind those rules, or like why that rule was actually established. They'll simply do what he or she is being told. So doing your duty and respecting authority are hallmarks of this level of development. So it's simply following the rule because it's a rule, not because the rule is right. That comes in the third stage, the post-conventional level. So this is morality that's based on more abstract principles. Um, and these might be rooted in things like political beliefs, religious beliefs, a combination of both, or simply just what you believe to be right. So this doesn't necessarily reflect the rules. It's something a little bit more personal, more complex, a little bit more based in the true meaning of the word morality. Oops, went backwards, forwards. All right, so um, that was Kohlberg's theory. And then Carol Gilligan came along and said that she thought males and females actually made moral decisions differently. So she wanted to build off of Kohlberg. So she wanted to know more about this and actually did an experiment, which you can read in depth on in page 76 because she came up with this scenario and wanted to test boys versus girls on how they came to logic out or sort of reason this particular scenario. So this is the scenario. Um, Gilligan used the story of Mr. Hines and the druggist, a tale that Kohlberg also used in his research. So the general idea of the story is this: Mr. Hines' wife is sick with a potentially fatal disease. Luckily, their small town pharmacy is the only place around that carries the drug. The problem is the drug costs an astronomical $10,000 and the druggist refuses to sell it for any less. Should Mr. Hines steal the drug? So through asking this question to boys versus girls, she developed a theory about their moral reasoning. She said that boys develop what's called a morality of justice, which is a morality based on the rule of the law. And she said that many boys believed that Mr. Hines should steal the medication, even though it's legally wrong. The boys reasoned that the judge would likely be lenient on Mr. Hines because of the circumstances. So the boys answered the question kind of logically like a math problem, whereas the girl subjects developed what she called a morality of care. So this is a morality that enables them to make moral decisions by a standard of how best to care for individuals. So the girl subjects considered the personal relationships involved. Girls worried that Mr. Hines might go to jail, which would make his wife sicker and leave no one around to care for her, provide her medicine. They also tried to think of other ways for Mr. Hines to get the drugs so they wouldn't have to leave his wife. The girls were more concerned about how Mr. Hines' actions would affect the dynamic between him and his wife. So while this is an interesting sort of set of results, more modern research has provided mixed support for Gilligan's theories and gender differences behind moral reasoning. So, what's important to note, yes, Gilligan came up with this theory, but both boys and girls learn the morality of care and the morality of justice. We all develop both sides of this argument as we grow and we develop our morals. Often girls develop faster than boys, we know that. So this means that we could maybe say that they develop their morality of care more quickly than boys do. But we all develop both. So here is sort of just some slides that summarize each of the theories, very similar to your handout. Cooley, looking glass self, Mead, the I and the me, significant others, generalized others, prep, play, and game stages. Goffman and his dramaturgical approach, impression management, face work. Erickson's 8 stages. Piaget, 4 stages of cognitive development, sensory, motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, formal operational. And Kohlberg's moral reasoning, pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional. And Gilligan's morality of care and morality of justice. So hopefully by learning about those different theories, you could maybe think about examples in your life that reflect each of the theories or how some examples might fit into each theory. But they're definitely not exclusive of one another. They're just different people's different ideas about how we come to develop who we are. So I'm going to include some links in your PowerPoint that's uploaded for this week, not in this lecture itself, but in the PowerPoint slides, in the notes section, and I'm not sure if they're hyperlinked in the actual slide, but the URLs are definitely included in the notes section that reflect a lot of these ideas. So this first video, Flawed, is really, really cool. It's a very beautiful little clip. It's an artist's sort of rendition of um, her flaws in her life and how she learned a little bit more about her self-concept, and I think you'll find it interesting. Um, so while you're watching this clip, ask yourself, what messages, realizations, or lessons did you take away related to this chapter? What does this clip tell us about self-concept? And what does this clip teach us about the looking glass self?